Hello, this is the Economics in Russian Studio, and I am your host, Mikhail Khazin. Please excuse me, I took off my jacket. I took it off because it's really hot in Moscow. For once, summer has actually arrived, but that's always nice. Today I want to talk about monetary policy, what it is, and why so many people don't understand it. And to start, I'd like to say a few words about. I'm talking about what is called the bank balance sheet and the banking multiplier, because, again, a lot of people don't understand this. For example, there was a pretty good economist, Sergei Zhuravlyev. I got to know him at the end of 1997 and the beginning of 1998, when he became an economic advisor to Prime Minister Chernomyrdin. We used to talk back then, but later our paths diverged. He was a senior research fellow or maybe the head of a department at the Institute of Economics of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He passed away, so I won't go into recalling all his titles. But during a certain discussion where he was talking on his blog with his members, his readers, about one of my speeches, he wrote something like, "What nonsense do these conservatives, anti-liberals, Khazin and company want? How do they not understand that you can't give out more credit than the deposits citizens have in banks, that banks, accordingly, can't lend out more money than they have on deposit?" When I read that, my jaw dropped, and in about 15 to 20 minutes you'll understand why. I realized that, frankly, this was a serious case. Then, something happened. There was this story involving me. Alexei Mamontov, president of the Currency Association, invited me to a certain discussion. I'm not afraid to say it, at the Higher School of Economics. And there, a representative of the central bank repeated the same point. But I have to admit, yes, I stood up and left, because I realized that if people at the modern central bank don't know what the banking multiplier is, then there's no point in discussing anything with them. You see, it's a really curious situation, and I keep running into it all the time. Well, for example, this happened back in 1997 when the decree on the liberalization of the gold market was being adopted. And at that time, Chubai suggested handing over control of gold operations to the banks because gold is a banking instrument, so let them handle it. So, coming from the presidential administration, I brought him a long list of objections, which included things that were only loosely related to the economy, like the legalization of criminal who work with gold, as well as purely economic arguments. Among other things, I said that as a result, gold production would drop by about half. Chubai's reaction was, "Well, why are you so sure? Look, yes, it's such a beautiful decree, so let's go ahead and adopt it, and maybe things will turn out." All right. As a result, the outflow of gold from the country illegally increased sharply. Gold production dropped by a little more than half, but this is a completely typical logic of Russian liberals who, when you start presenting them with the facts, say, "Well, what if we get lucky? What if things work out? What if it turns out well?" It's always bad, but this time, for us, it'll be good. There are two explanations here. One is that they're idiots who simply don't understand what is being discussed. That's one option, the humane one. And the other option is that they know perfectly well that things will turn out badly, but their goal is to make things bad. When I read the explanations of today's experts on monetary policy, what's happening, I get exactly the same sense of déjà vu, like I'm sitting in Chubai's office, talking to him the same way. I'm having exactly the same conversation, no arguments, no logic, a complete lack of understanding of the professional essence of the issue, but this kind of confidence, like, well, since we're in charge here, we have the right to try. I immediately remember the old joke about how a certain Jew came to. He goes to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, what should I do? My mother-in-law is dying. The doctors can't help. I don't know what to do." The rabbi says, "Draw a red triangle on your gate." He draws it, comes back 2 days later and says, "Rabbi, it didn't help." Then draw a yellow circle around the red triangle. He draws it, comes back 3 days later. The rabbi asks, "So, what now?" "Well, draw this. Now, around the yellow circle, draw a green square." He says, "Rabbi, my mother-in-law has died." What a pity. I still had so many ideas. The sheer number of ideas our liberal leaders in finance and economics have just amazes me, but none of it has anything to do with real life. And now, a bit more to the point, so it's clear what we're talking about. So, let's imagine we have a certain country where all the money amounts to 1 ruble. And, accordingly, in this country there's only one bank. Just one, so we don't have to bother with transfers between different banks. From the central bank's perspective, it's all the same thing. They sort of have a unified picture. And so, some person who happened to have this ruble decided to become the owner of this very bank. And the charter capital of this bank is that very ruble. And so, when the bank starts operating, it has a balance of 1 ruble. On the asset side, it has a ruble sitting in the cash register, and on the liability side, and obligations, it's the obligation to return that ruble to the owner if the bank shuts down. So, there are assets and liabilities, and they are always equal. And so this bank opens. With these big, beautiful doors, the door swings open, and in walks Pedia. He goes up to the clerk and says, "I want to build a little house, and for that I need a loan of 1 ruble. The clerk says, "Great, we have a ruble. Let's open a loan account for you right now." And so, accordingly, a loan account is opened for Pedia. That is, the right to take a ruble from this loan account. Is there a ruble? There is. And now the balance sheet of Bank 2, because on the asset side it has a ruble in cash, and Pedia's obligation to repay the ruble. Actually, it's not even just a ruble, but a little more, taking interest into account, but that's in the future. And on the liabilities side, it also has 2 rubles. First, the obligation of 1 ruble to the owner, and second, the obligation to give a ruble to Pedia at his first request from the credit account. 2 rubles. Pedia hires Kolia and buys some high-quality bricks. In theory, he could withdraw that ruble and give 20 kopecks to Kolia and buy bricks for 80 kopecks. But since everything is controlled, everything is regulated, and everything goes through accounts, then, for this reason, he transfers 20 kopecks from his credit account to Kolia's card. And he transfers 80 kopecks to the owner of the brick factory to his account, which is in the same bank. Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that our balance has changed, because just as there were 2 rubles, there are still 2 rubles, but there is now 0 on the credit account. Piteous. And, accordingly, Vazia and Kolya, one of them has 20 kopecks on his card, which he hasn't withdrawn yet. That is, this is the bank's obligation to give him 20 kopecks. And, accordingly, the owner of the brick factory has 80 kopecks in his account, which he can withdraw. But this money is still in the bank account, while the ruble is still lying in the cash register. And that's why, when Dima comes and asks for a loan, say, to open a small shop, he can be given another ruble. As a result, this whole system multiplies. The bank's balance grows. At the same time, I want to point out that the single ruble is still lying in the cash register, just as before. If no cash withdrawals and only one bank, everything stays within the bank, and this whole picture is visible. Of course, in real life. In order to prevent an infinite amount of money from being created, the picture is a bit more complicated. Because the central bank, and this is where the central bank comes in, regulates the monetary system. And it says, okay, if you issue a loan to someone, you have to reserve a portion of the money. If you have 1 ruble in your cash register, you can't lend entire ruble. You must lend, if this person, only 20 kopecks. You put in reserve, if this person, 50 kopecks. But if that person, you a reserve amount of the loan, unreliable borrower. All of this is already delicate nuance. What matters is something else. The banking system creates money that only works because this money is kept in accounts at banks. And no matter who takes out the loan, the money still stays in the bank, and the bank can circulate it again, allowing for a fresh and renewed distribution of the item. This is a fundamentally important point. For this reason, any economy is characterized by a banking multiplier. And in a normal economy, this banking multiplier has certain values, and any deviation from these average values indicates that something is wrong with the economy. So what is this value? It's roughly between 4 and 6. If your banking multiplier is above 6, then it means that banks are issuing too many loans to each other. And for this reason, it's clear that a financial bubble is starting to form in the economy. I'll talk more about this later. But if the credit multiplier is below 4, it means there isn't enough money in circulation for the economy to function normally. And then what happens is, what in Russia during the 1990s came to be known as the non-payment crisis. And now, here come some examples. Since I was, between 1995 and 1997, the head of the Credit Policy Department at the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Economy, and even the Executive Secretary of the Government Commission for Combating Unaccounted Cash Circulation, I have a bit of an idea of what the situation looked like. So, the credit multiplier kept falling throughout the 1990s. And by the mid-90s, it had dropped to 1.2. While the minimum level for everything to function normally is 4. This means that banks weren't issuing loans. Ruble loans. Why? Because transactions were either in cash, bypassing the banking system, or in dollars. By the way, they did issue dollar loans, if anyone remembers. and those who, for example, took out a dollar mortgage. In 1998, suffered greatly when the ruble devalued rapidly. But now things are a bit different, kind of in the other direction. So, secondly, by the way, let's note that today our multiplier is below 4. We still haven't reached 4. The second indicator is the volume of the money supply relative to GDP. Why? If there's too much money, they start to. If there's not enough money, then again, it's the same story. That means the banking system isn't working. It means the central bank isn't working, and monetary surrogates appear, or the turnover is taken out of the country. In other words, some fundamentally important operations start taking place outside the country. A classic example, which happened in Russia in the 90s, and not just in the 90s, is tolling. That's when foreign raw materials were brought to an aluminum plant. Aluminum was smelted from it and then sent right back there. So, the aluminum plant, instead of being an entity that generates profit, it turned into an operator processing someone else's raw materials. And playing Russian, this means that all the profit stayed over there, abroad. This is exactly the kind of situation that no sovereign state should ever allow. So, the volume of the money supply in relation to the country's GDP should also be within certain limits, and that's about 100% of GDP. That's the broad money supply. What is the broad money supply? It's what you get after the banking system has multiplied the cash money. Let me remind you, in our bank, there was a ruble sitting in the cash register. That ruble is cash money. But what appears on the balance sheet after several lending operations is the broad money supply, because the owners of those credit accounts, they don't know whether that ruble is real or already multiplied. To them, it's absolutely the same. And that's why the broad money supply is what characterizes the money circulation, because the owners of credit accounts believe they can use their money however they want. So, if we have, in a normal economy, the broad money supply should be about 100% of GDP. Well, depending on the specifics of the economy, it can range from 80 to 120%. If it's higher, then again, that's financial bubbles. Which, by the way, makes it harder for banks to operate because the money can't be put to work. That is, the banking multiplier starts to fall. If there's too much cash, nobody takes out loans. Why would they? Why? Accordingly, if the money supply is small, it means either the banking system isn't working or there's very little cash in circulation. And then, accordingly, the central bank has to somehow inject them into the system. Let's note, and this is a fundamentally important point, that if our money supply is insufficient, then when you inject money into the economy that is meant for internal circulation, for example, investment funds, inflation actually goes down. Why is that? Because the economy can't function without money. It's like lubrication. If your money supply is below the norm, it means that monetary surrogates are being used. In the 1990s in Russia, people used dollars, MMM tickets, all sorts of things like that, tax exemptions, and various other schemes. Any use of monetary surrogates leads to a decrease in tax revenues for the budget. That's just how it is. Basically, for anyone involved in this, it's obvious. Absolutely obvious, really. And that's why any government always tries to eliminate monetary surrogates. But to do that, there has to be enough money in the economy. So now, let's talk about the volume of the money supply. So, in Russia in 1992, dating back to the Soviet era, the money supply was about 100%. In 93, it was 80%. In 94, there was a sharp drop to 40%. But that's the result of Matyukin's work, who was the head of the central bank in the early 90s. Then, accordingly, in 95, I don't quite remember, but I think it was 24%. In 1996, it was 12%, and by 1998, it was 4%. So, right before the default, the money supply was very small compared to the size of the economy. All the turnover, all the money was immediately going into the GKO market. Salaries weren't being paid, and as a result, people were mostly using private money substitutes, primarily dollars. So now, here's the question. What was the monetary base? That is, the amount of cash in the United States at the start of the crisis? The answer. It was $0.8 trillion. Question. The GDP of the United States was about 15 trillion. How is that possible? That's a very small amount of cash for such a large GDP. The thing is, the banking multiplier in the US was incredibly high. 17. And there were massive financial bubbles, which burst in the fall of 2008. And here's the question. So, what did the Federal Reserve do next? It increased by 2014. The monetary base, that is, the cash in circulation, from 0.8 trillion to 3.3 trillion. That is, by 4 times. In the 90s, all the Gaidar protégés were yelling at us. If you print money, there will be inflation. In the US, from 2008 to 2014, there was no inflation at all. Why? The thing is, at the same time as the monetary base grew fourfold, from 1.7 to just over 4, the banking multiplier dropped. In other words, the broad money supply, which is what actually causes inflation, didn't grow at all. So, there simply couldn't have been any inflation. Well, at least not monetary inflation. And that's exactly what happened. There wasn't any. But in 2014, the Federal Reserve stopped printing money. Why? For a very simple reason. The thing is, if the multiplier drops below 4, a payment crisis begins. That kind of mess. It's not like there are Gaidar-style reformers sitting in the Federal Reserve of the United States. They understand that allowing a payment crisis is absolutely unacceptable under any circumstances. And that's why they stopped the money emission. After that, other mechanisms kicked in. I described them in my book Memories of the Future, so I won't repeat myself, but the gist is more or less clear. And as a result, something remarkable happened. They were printing money, but inflation wasn't rising. Let's note that this is far from the most surprising thing that can happen in monetary policy. Now I'll tell you another remarkable story. Let me remind you, by August 1998, our money supply relative to GDP was just 4%. Mostly, there were monetary surrogates, and the budget was empty because it's hard to pay with surrogates. And inflation was high. Why? Because the circulation of surrogates is always accompanied by high transaction costs. So, roughly speaking, if you're trading tax exemptions, they're treated like securities, and every seller wants to get their cut. And for this reason, in the end, you won't get 100% of those tax exemptions. You'll get 70 or 60, or even just 40. That's why everyone loved dealing with all sorts of promissory notes from natural monopolies, and so on in the 90s. And so on. Moving on. When Yushchenko came in September 1998, he started injecting emission money into the economy, but at the same time strictly monitored to make sure it wasn't converted into dollars. He began to fight against monetary surrogates. How? Well, here I'll allow myself not to go into these details. As a result, by 2002, he had increased the money supply to 40 to 45% of GDP. Let's say up to 40. In other words, he increased the relative money supply by about 10 times, and in absolute terms, taking into account GDP growth, by about 15 times. And during all this time, inflation was falling. But as soon as he left, problems began. I remember very well how I was watching. This was in 2004. I was no longer working, but I still had the habit of keeping an eye on the numbers. By the way, I should note that now, due to the specifics of our statistics, which have come under the control of the IMF, our methodologies are constantly changing. That's why it's impossible to compare the numbers I looked at back then with the ones we have now. These are different numbers, and it's not really clear what they show. So, back then, I was looking at them. Industry, I remember this very well. In 2003, when Yushchenko's policy was still in effect, let me remind you, he left in 2002. So, in 2003, industrial inflation was 14%, and in 2004 it jumped to 28%. Inflation doubled. And this is the direct and undeniable result of Ignatieff's stringent policy of tightening monetary policy, supposedly implemented to effectively fight that very persistent inflation. That is to say, instead of continuing Yushchenko's established policy and effectively reducing inflation, the central bank actually started significantly tightening the money supply. And since there wasn't nearly enough of it, it was indeed 2.5 times less than what would be considered normal under these conditions of a severe money shortage. Such tightening and a strict monetary policy inevitably lead to increased and persistent inflation. Why? Because money gets replaced by monetary surrogates, the circulation of which at every step comes with very high transaction costs. That's the whole picture. Since then, our money supply has been above 45%. Well, it fluctuates a bit, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, 45, 40, 45-40. The shortage of money supply in our country has never been resolved. Today, this is primarily a lack of investment component. And there is concrete proof of this. When the Houston became prime minister, he began, especially after the start of the special military operation, to increase the government's investment activity. In other words, additional money started flowing into the economy. And as a result, at the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023, not only did economic growth begin, but inflation also fell. I've already said, when your money supply starts to grow, if it's far below the norm, then monetary surrogates are pushed out and cost-push inflation drops. By around February 2023, inflation had practically reached zero. Of course, in the consumer sector it was still present to some extent, but overall in the economy it was close to zero. And that's when our partners started to panic. How could this be? In a country at war, economic growth began and inflation was falling. This completely contradicts liberal principles. So what did they start doing? They began to sharply tighten the issuance of loans and started devaluing the ruble. And this is where things get really interesting. I've already mentioned the term monetary inflation during my speech. What is monetary inflation? It's a situation where there is an excess of money in the economy, and as a result, this money starts looking for ways to be used. Competition begins among different money holders for certain assets, and prices go up. It's a completely typical situation. When there are a lot of buyers on the market but few sellers, the sellers start raising prices. But sometimes, the situation is different. Imagine you want to buy a car that costs, let's say, $10,000 in Germany. The question is, how much money do you need for that in rubles? Well, obviously, it depends on the ruble exchange rate. If the ruble exchange rate is 50, then you need to multiply 50 by 10,000, that's 500,000. If the ruble exchange rate is 100, then you need 1,000,000. In other words, regardless of the amount of money in the Russian economy or anything else, the price of the car is determined by the exchange rate. If we had domestic production, we wouldn't care much about this, because all the raw materials would be priced in rubles, salaries would be in rubles, and everything else too. But we don't have domestic production of consumer goods, whether industrial or for private consumption. It just doesn't exist. We get all of it through imports. And that means if the ruble is devalued, prices will go up. No internal monetary operations, like raising the interest rate, can affect this situation. The leadership of our monetary authorities, who claimed they were fighting inflation, the cost inflation caused by the ruble's devaluation, were blatantly lying. That's not true. It's impossible to change cost-push inflation with the interest rate. It's connected to other factors. As a result, the monetary authorities pulled off a scheme. In the spring, they devalued the ruble. Prices went up because of that, and supposedly to fight the price increase, they started raising the interest rate. In reality, they sharply reduced the flow of money into the economy. The banking credit multiplier dropped because people simply can't take out loans at 30% interest. It's impossible. And then serious problems started in the economy. Well, that's true. I and other experts said, guys, okay, you don't care about the economy. even though the country is at war. But think about it yourselves. This is also about social policy. The mortgage market will die. So what did the so-called experts tell us? They said, no, everything will be fine. Everything's under control. Back and forth. Well, now we see the result. Today, if the government wants to stimulate mortgages, it has to pay the banks as much money as it would cost to buy 2 or 3 apartments outright without a mortgage. In other words, it would be more beneficial for the government to use the money it spends to subsidize mortgages for beneficiaries to just buy apartments and give them to people, instead of giving the money to the banks. In other words, the monetary authorities have wildly destabilized the financial system of the Russian Federation. Absolutely wildly. At the same time, the events at the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023 confirmed the basic principles of monetary policy. If there isn't enough money in the economic system, then injecting investments into this system leads not only to rapid economic growth, but also to a decrease in inflation. So, what's next? Yes, let's point out something fundamentally important. Generally speaking, monetary theory differs from economic theory precisely in that it introduces an additional factor called the banking system. Economists, well, as I explained to you using the example of Sergei Zurevlev, and I can't remember the name of that central bank official, often don't understand this. It's another matter that they really should know this, because in theory, how the banking system works is written in textbooks, but in practice, it's considered that financial education is one thing and economic education is another. Maybe there's some logic to that, because for business managers, knowing how the banking system works isn't really essential. Their job is to manage the business, so to speak. By the way, let's note that financiers and bankers often don't know how the business side of things works. This, by the way, is the reason why accountants shouldn't be appointed as crisis managers, because they're not inclined to hand out money. And very often, crisis management policy is precisely about giving out money. You just need to understand who to give it to. The story with the United States in 2014, well, 2008, 2014, and with Russia in 2022 and 2023 clearly shows that there are situations where issuing money leads to lower inflation and sharp economic growth. Today, in our country, the money supply is understated because it essentially lacks an investment component. In other words, only the government is providing investments. People involved in real production say that even the largest companies have halted their investment projects, except for Gazprom, and as a result, the entire system of their suppliers has come to a standstill. Well, you understand, right, that if we're talking about building, say, a large chemical plant, then energy, logistics, water treatment, and so on are all tied to it. There's a whole chain. And, accordingly, as soon as investments stop, all these enterprises immediately freeze, because big orders from major clients are the foundation of their operations. That's exactly what's happening in the Russian economy today. By the way, this is also what will happen soon in the West, and in fact, it's already happening in Europe, especially in Germany. The reasons are a bit different. But, well, there you have it. But the essence is the same. As soon as you, close off the opportunity for industrial enterprises to make a profit, here, it's because of the lack of cheap loans and investments, and in the West, in Europe, it's because of the lack of cheap raw materials. Entire supply chains collapse. Right now, entire supply chains are starting to collapse here. By the way, a similar situation is happening, for example, in construction. Because, well, it's just impossible. They've made the whole economic system, well, basically unprofitable. All the working capital has been pulled into the banking system. The banks are sitting on this money, including the money of ordinary people, because investing in your own business is impossible. It's just too expensive. So, for this reason, everyone has put their money into bank deposits. As a result, the banks have a colossal amount of deposits, something like almost 70 trillion. They have to pay interest on these, but it's impossible to make a profit. What should they do? Buy government securities? But then what? Are we really falling back into the GKO situation again? So basically, we're following in the footsteps of Dubinin and Chubai. Well, honestly, there's nothing surprising about that. If we look at who's in charge of Russia's monetary authorities today, they're basically the children and grandchildren of Gaidar and Chubai. So, I've more or less explained how the credit and monetary system is set up. Let me repeat the basic indicators once more. There are two indicators. They're not completely independent. They're closely connected, but still, they're different. One of them is the volume of the money supply, which should be about 100% of GDP. The other is the banking multiplier, which should be between 4 and 6. In a normal economy, of course, the economy can be abnormal. There's no getting around that. By the way, let's note one more thing. There's the famous Fisher equation, which, all the liberals treat as some kind of dogma. They say, if you look at the Fisher equation and something else, I won't even go into what that is. Anyone interested can just look up the Fisher equation online. But there are two factors there that need to be taken into account. The first factor, when we talk about the amount of money, about the money in circulation, it means all money, including monetary surrogates. All the calculations done in the 90s by the so-called bank specialists, when it was headed by Dubinin and Oleg Sashenko, were about ruble transactions, and by 1998, those made up only 4%. Everything else was not in rubles. And they didn't count the non-ruble amounts. In our current SS situation, there's something similar going on. And then the situation is very simple. If you don't have enough money, one of two things happens. Either surrogates appear, or the economy shrinks to match the amount of money available. That's what Gaidar did. He crashed the Russian economy. That's what's being done today. The lack of money is crashing the Russian economy. And the second factor, which isn't accounted for in Fisher's formula, is the so-called velocity of money. The thing is, nobody really knows what that is. There are some relative indicators, but it's known that if inflation rises, the velocity of money increases. There are different tools to increase the velocity of money. For example, there's a tool called so-called Gesell money. It is sometimes used. Well, for instance, there was a famous story in the former Shemuratov collective farm in Bashkiria. There was an experiment, I think in 2010 or 2011, when, due to a shortage of money, they started using so-called Shemuratix, Gesell money. The essence of Gesell money is that when they are issued, their value decreases after a certain period of time. So, roughly speaking, for the first 2 weeks you could exchange 1 shemeratic for 1 ruble, after 2 weeks only for 90 kopecks, and so on. And as a result of using them, there was no money, no credit, nothing. This was after the crisis of 2008. This system was introduced by Rustam Davletbeev. And so, when they launched this thing, it suddenly turned out that everyone started using it. And it was actually funny. Taxi drivers who drove from Ufa to Shemiratovo agreed to be paid in these very shemeratics. Why? They said, because we get shemeratics, we go to the local store where the collective farm sells its products. We use these shemeratics to buy food and bring it back to Ufa. We're coming out ahead. But of course, the central bank got furious and filed a lawsuit over the issuance of monetary surrogates. I actually participated in this process as an expert, and we won for a very simple reason. The Supreme Court of Bashkiria said, "Here of the functions of money is listed in the encyclopedia. One of the functions of money is saving. Shemeratics, like Gazel's money, since they depreciate, cannot serve as a means of saving. Therefore, these are not monetary surrogates, they are vouchers. And vouchers can be used. The only thing is, you can't pay salaries with them. Fine, we won't pay salaries with them." That's it. That's the story. And since the velocity of money is unknown, moreover, you shouldn't just look at the velocity of money, but you have to consider the average velocity taking into account all monetary surrogates. If, in your economy, the ruble accounts for 10% of circulation, like it did back in, say, 1997, and dollars make up 40%, then you need to look at the velocity of the ruble with a weight of 10, that is, 1/10. And then, you also need to consider the average velocity of the dollar with a weight of 0.4. Plus, there are also some other instruments like EU promissory notes, or Gazprom notes, or something else, each with their own turnover rates. And only then can you somehow try to assess all of this. There are no methods for this, for evaluating this velocity of circulation. For this reason, the Fisher equation is a meaningless thing. It looks nice in textbooks, but in practice, you just can't use it. Of course, if you have a precise understanding of the complete movement, so to speak, of every ruble or every dollar, then you could try to calculate it. But you see, when I first started my job as the executive secretary of the Government Commission for Combating Unaccounted Cash Circulation, we used to sit in an office on Novi Arbat. The White House was nearby. The commission members were various generals from different law enforcement agencies, ranging from the Tax Service, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Tax Police, to the FSB. You know, just like that, major generals and lieutenant generals. And since this was 1995, all of them were, generally speaking, around 50 or even over 50 years old. And I had just been appointed as the head of the Credit Policy Department. I was 33 years old. And they all looked at me and said, "Misha, you're lucky. You landed a big position while you're still young, and you have a lot you can learn." And they would all come to see me for tea after meetings at the White House, and they would tell me how life really works. And then one general, I won't say from where, says, "Misha, these idiots in the White House, yeah, those Chubaiite liberals, they've lost their minds. They seriously want to get rid of cash circulation. How are they supposed to take bribes then? That's just not possible. In this country, there are a huge number of activities that are unprofitable if you pay taxes on them. That is, if you pay all the taxes, you have to shut down these kinds of businesses because they become unprofitable. No, you can raise prices, but then, accordingly, you lose a huge number of potential clients. In our country, by the way, it's still good in the sense that there are a lot of activities that aren't monetized yet. But we're already moving toward monetizing everything and anything. And as a result, a lot of things disappear. And so, the kind of work that used to cost just a few kopecks. Well, roughly speaking, yeah, like when a grandma would ask her neighbor to fix an outlet. She gave him some tea and a pastry. He fixed the outlet and left. But, you see, in the West, if someone hears about a story like that, it's a disaster for the grandma. Why? Because the house is insured. The insurance company won't pay if the electrical work was done by someone without a license, without paperwork, and without payment. Because she'll say, oh, so he's the one who burned everything down, right? And that's it. And as a result, fixing an outlet, instead of just tea and a pastry, suddenly costs a lot of money. Of course, the person who does these outlets is very happy, his income shoots up, but the number of clients drops sharply too. So what do grandmas start doing? They start saying, oh, great. We're paying our utilities here. Be so kind as to send us an electrician. And then it all begins, right? We all know what happens next. By the way, the same thing happens in the United States. At first, it's impossible to get an electrician for several months, and then, when he finally shows up, it turns out he doesn't know what to do, doesn't know how to do it, or something else like that. And you can't just call your neighbor. Because in that case, you lose your insurance. So, all these nuances of financial dealings, what you can do and what you can't, unfortunately, these abstract pseudo-economists, well, they just don't get it at all. Anyone who deals with real money circulation knows roughly what the shadow turnover should be in a given type of economy in order to maintain the GDP. If you try to eliminate it completely, your GDP drops sharply. I remember very well, again, I was 33 years old, incredibly young by those standards, and already a department head. I was the youngest department head in the Ministry of Economy. And, accordingly, there were as many as 39 departments there. And these old generals would tell me, of course, we're fighting this. But at the same time, we know for sure that there's a level below which not only is it unnecessary to fight, it's actually harmful. Well, in general, they taught me a lot about life. That's it. And understanding, what you can and can't do. Unfortunately, this complete irresponsibility of the liberal bureaucracy, let me remind you, these were people, most of whom became generals back in Soviet times. But the current liberal concept says that a liberal official isn't responsible for anything. He's only responsible for following formal instructions. He doesn't care about the substance of his work, nor about what exactly makes this job unique. He doesn't care what he does. His job is to follow instructions, just in case anything happens. So, there's no need to do anything at all. Well, in the case of the leadership of our financial authorities, the instructions are written by the IMF. And they have a rock-solid excuse for that. They say that the activities of the central bank are supposedly carried out in cooperation with international financial institutions. Here you go. They've written the best instructions in the world. It doesn't get any better than this. The fact that the leadership of the United States acts in complete contradiction to these instructions, but in line with monetary science. They say, that doesn't interest us. That doesn't interest us. Let them do whatever they want over there. But here, we have the instructions. We follow the instructions. So what complaints can you have against us? There's a political decision. It's written right there in the Constitution. And this is the main problem of our modern life. The thing is, officials on whom the life of the whole country depends, whether they are part of the executive branch or a special body like the central bank, are in no way held accountable for the results of their actions. Because otherwise, what they did in 2023, when they destroyed a system that was already ensuring economic growth and, accordingly, bringing down inflation, just like Gershchenko did in 1999 to 2002, no one was held responsible for that. Moreover, this policy continues. Well, actually, if we're talking about the details, I invite everyone to my private Telegram channel. There's a chat there where, in fact, we discuss this and other topics as well. But for now, our time has come to an end. This was Economics in Russian on Air. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.